His wife left him the same night he won $12 million, and she found out on the morning news. She stood up at their own anniversary dinner in front of 40 people, in the house he maintained, at the table he paid for, and told the room she was done with him. She had already planned it. Her mother was in the kitchen, her cousin was by the fireplace, and the man she walked away from sat quietly, thanked his guests, excused himself to his study, and opened a desk drawer containing a letter that would dismantle everything she thought she was building. He didn't say a word that night. Not one word. Because what his wife didn't know, what her cousin didn't know, what her mother standing in that kitchen didn't know, was that 3 days before she humiliated him in front of everyone they knew, the city had decided that the ground beneath his silence was worth $12,400,000. And by midnight, it was already done. The question isn't how he won, the question is how long he'd already been winning, while she was busy telling everyone he had nothing. If this story is already getting to you, hit that like button right now. It costs you nothing, and it tells me to keep these coming. And if you're new here, subscribe so you never miss one. Now drop your city in the comments. I want to know where in the world you're watching from today. Now let me take you all the way back to the night it happened, because you need to be in that dining room to understand exactly what kind of patience we're talking about. Calvin Rees had ironed his shirt himself that morning. That detail mattered to him. It always had. He pressed the collar flat against the board with the same careful attention he gave everything in that house: the swept porch, the oiled door hinges, the dining table, set with the good china Phyllis only brought out when company was coming. He was not a man who needed to be told twice to do something right. He was a man who did it right before anyone thought to ask. The house on Beatty's Ford Road was modest by the standards Phyllis kept. 3 bedrooms, a covered back porch, a yard that Calvin maintained himself on Saturday mornings with a push mower and a thermos of black coffee. It was not the kind of house that appeared in the magazines Lorraine left on their coffee table. But it was paid for. Every beam and brick of it was paid for, and Calvin had never once mentioned that fact out loud because it seemed to him like the kind of thing that should not need saying. He carried the extra chairs up from the basement 2 at a time, moving through the hallway with the quiet efficiency of a man comfortable in his own home. On his second trip, he passed the open study door. The hand-drawn survey map was pinned to the wall where it had always been, his grandfather's careful lines marking the 4.7 acres in the Ballantine corridor, the property boundaries rendered in pencil so precise they looked like something official. Calvin did not stop to look at it. He knew every line from memory. Derek Price was standing near the fireplace when Calvin came back through the living room. He had arrived early, as he always did, and had immediately arranged himself in the spot that commanded the most attention. He was wearing a jacket that cost more than Calvin's monthly pension check, holding a glass of something amber, talking about his Ballantine development project to 2 men who were nodding along like they understood what he was saying. Derek's eyes cut briefly toward the study as Calvin passed. Just a glance. Then back to his audience. Lorraine had gone straight to the kitchen when she arrived, the way she always did, moving through Phyllis's home with the proprietary ease of a woman who considered it an extension of her own. She did not greet Calvin directly. She offered him a nod that could have meant anything, set her purse on the counter, and began telling Phyllis's cousin how to arrange the serving dishes. 40 people filled the house by 7 o'clock. The dining room hummed with the warm noise of a gathered community. Gospel playing low from the kitchen speaker, somebody's perfume mixing with the smell of pot roast, conversations overlapping and braiding together the way they do when people who have known each other a long time are fed and comfortable. Calvin moved through it all at his own pace. He refilled water glasses. He welcomed people at the door. He shook hands and accepted compliments about the food, though Phyllis had handled most of the cooking, and he said so each time. Phyllis worked the room like she had rehearsed it. She was dressed in burgundy, her hair done the way she wore it. For occasions she considered important, and she laughed at the right moments and touched people's arms when she spoke to them. She was good at this. Calvin had always known she was good at this. Dinner was served, and the table settled into the comfortable rhythm of a meal going well. Someone told a story about a cousin's wedding. Someone else argued about the Panthers' offensive line. Calvin ate slowly and listened and felt, in the way he sometimes allowed himself to feel on evenings like this, something close to contentment. Then Phyllis stood up. The table quieted the way tables do when the host rises with a glass in her hand. People smiled in anticipation. Calvin set down his fork. She did not look at him when she started speaking. She talked about growth. She talked about alignment. She used the word journey twice. And then, in a voice calibrated perfectly for the size of the room, she announced that she had filed for divorce and that she had met someone whose vision matched where she was going in life. The silence that followed was the particular silence of 40 people being asked to process something in public that they were not equipped to process in public. Calvin did not move. He was aware of Derek by the fireplace, no longer in the dining room, but visible through the doorway, who had not changed his expression at all. He was aware that Lorraine had not appeared from the kitchen. He was aware of 40 pairs of eyes moving between him and his wife with the helpless, involuntary attention of witnesses. He picked up his napkin. He folded it once and set it beside his plate. He stood up and he thanked his guests for coming, and he said he hoped they would finish their dinner, and he meant it. Then he walked down the hallway to his study and closed the door behind him. The room was quiet. The survey map was on the wall. The desk was where it always was. Calvin sat down, opened the bottom drawer, and took out the envelope from the City of Charlotte Infrastructure Development Office. He unfolded the letter and read it again, though he already knew every word. $12,400,000, the Silver Line corridor, his grandfather's name in the deed history, his name on the offer line. He folded the letter. He checked the time. Then he picked up his phone and dialed Marcus Webb. It was 11 o'clock at night. Webb answered on the second ring. But to understand why that phone call meant what it meant, you have to understand what the 14 years before it actually looked like. Their first year was good. That is the part of the story that tends to get lost, so it is worth saying plainly. When Calvin Reese married Phyllis Price in the Fellowship Hall of Greater Faith Missionary Baptist on a Saturday afternoon in early October, 14 years before that anniversary dinner, there was genuine feeling in that room. Calvin had saved for 8 months to buy her the ring she wanted. He had stood at that altar with his hands clasped and his eyes forward and said every word he meant to say. And Phyllis, in the ivory dress her mother had helped her pick out, had looked at him like he was exactly enough. The first 3 years were steady and warm. Calvin was still on his postal route then, up before the sun, home by 4, reliable as a clock on the wall. They had a routine that fit them. Sunday mornings at Greater Faith, pot roast on the stove by noon, her feet in his lap by 8 o'clock in the evening. He was not a flashy man, and he did not pretend to be, and for a while that was not a problem. The problem arrived gradually, the way most problems do in marriage, not as a single event, but as a slow change in the light. Phyllis got her compliance certification in year 4 and moved to a regional financial firm with a downtown Charlotte address and a business card that finally felt like something she could hand to people without apology. Her salary doubled, her circle expanded. She started attending the kind of events that required a certain kind of husband, and Calvin, in his government-issue patience and his sensible shoes, began to feel less like a partner and more like something she worked around. Derek was background noise in the early years, a cousin who showed up at holidays with loud opinions and louder cologne, who talked about his development projects the way some men talk about cars they do not own yet. But as Phyllis's professional profile grew, Derek's voice grew with it. He started calling more. He started showing up at dinners Calvin had not been told about. He had a talent for arriving at the exact moment when Phyllis was most susceptible to the idea that she deserved more, and he exercised that talent with quiet consistency. Lorraine operated differently. She never raised her voice. She never delivered a verdict directly to Calvin's face. Her method was the aside, the meaningful pause, the question asked just loudly enough for him to hear from the next room. At church, she told the women in her circle that Phyllis was carrying a lot. At dinner tables, she would look at Calvin's hands, working man's hands, clean but unmanicured, and say nothing, which said everything. She had been building a case against Calvin for 14 years, and she had never once needed to make an argument out loud. It was around year 6 that Calvin's grandfather, Roosevelt Reese, drove up from Rock Hill to walk the Ballantine parcel with him for the last time. The old man was 81 then, moving slowly but thinking clearly, and he put his hand on a pine tree at the eastern edge of the property and told Calvin the same thing he had told him when he signed the deed over in 1999. He said the land was not for selling until the time was right. He said Calvin would know when that was. He died 8 months later, and Calvin pinned the hand-drawn survey map to his study wall and did not discuss the property with anyone. At a family cookout the following summer, Derek wandered into Calvin's study looking for the bathroom and stopped in front of the map. He stood there longer than a man looking for a bathroom needed to stand anywhere. When Calvin came to find him, Derek pointed at the map and asked, casual as a man asking about the weather, what exactly that land was worth these days. Calvin said he wasn't sure. That was not a lie, it was a decision. Derek brought it up twice more over the following years, both times framed as opportunity, as family, taking care of family, as a chance for Calvin to finally do something that mattered. The first time, he offered $2 million through a one-page letter he called a term sheet. Calvin read it at the kitchen table, folded it in half, and handed it back without a word. The second time, Derek raised it to $2,100,000 and called it a gift. Calvin said he needed to think about it. He had been thinking about it for 7 years. The answer was always the same. What Calvin never told Phyllis was that he knew exactly what the land was worth. He had watched the Silver Line transit corridor plans develop in the city's public records for 3 years. He had watched the Ballantine development pressure build. He knew that his 4.7 acres sat directly in the path of something large and inevitable, and he had said nothing because it was his land, and he was a patient man, and there was no urgency that required him to speak before he was ready. What he did not know until he found out in year 13 was that Phyllis had given Derek $180,000 of her own money to invest in the Ballantine mixed-use project. She had not consulted Calvin, she had not mentioned it. She had handed her cousin nearly $200,000 and apparently trusted that he had the situation under control. The night Phyllis told Lorraine that Calvin would never be what she needed him to be, she was standing in Lorraine's kitchen after a Lynx chapter dinner, still wearing her name badge, her voice low and certain with the tone of someone who has already made a decision and is simply waiting for the right moment to announce it. What Phyllis never understood was that Calvin's silence was never weakness. The city of Charlotte was about to make that plain. What Derek Price had built in his mind was an empire. On paper, it was more modest than that. A $22 million mixed-use development project in Charlotte's Ballantine corridor, a carefully assembled collection of retail storefronts, mid-range apartments, and a parking structure that Derek described to investors as a transformational anchor for the neighborhood's next chapter. He had a rendering framed on the wall of his office on South Tryon Street. He had a pitch deck he could walk through in 11 minutes without glancing at his notes. He had 5 investors at the table, including Phyllis, and he had spent 2 years telling all of them that the project was as close to guaranteed as anything in real estate ever gets. What he had not told them was that it was not guaranteed at all. Derek knew about the Silver Line before most people in Charlotte's development community did. He had a contact inside the city's infrastructure planning office. Not an official relationship, just a man who played golf on the same course and talked more than he should have after the 3rd hole. What that contact told Derek, in broad enough strokes to be useful and specific enough to be alarming, was that the city's federally mandated transit expansion was moving through the Ballantine corridor, and that the access road Derek needed for his southern anchor was sitting on land the city intended to acquire. That land was Calvin Rees's 4.7 acres. Derek had understood the problem with perfect clarity. If the city got to Calvin first, the acquisition price would reflect the land's true strategic value, a number that would make Derek's informal offers look like an insult. And if Derek couldn't secure that parcel, the access road died, the permits died, and $22 million of assembled capital would have nowhere to go. So Derek did what Derek always did when a problem had a family angle. He applied pressure through the people Calvin trusted and worked the situation from the inside out. The Christmas dinner 2 years before the anniversary happened at Lorraine's house in University City, the way it always did. Good china on a table that seated 14, sweet potato pie cooling on the counter, the television on low in the background with nobody watching it. Derek arrived with a bottle of wine and a manila folder, which was not the kind of thing a man brought to Christmas dinner unless he intended to conduct business. He waited until the plates were cleared. Then he slid the folder across the table toward Calvin and called it an early gift. Inside was a formal option agreement. $2,100,000 for the 4.7 acres, exercisable within 90 days. Derek had attached a 1-page summary that described it as a mutually beneficial arrangement, a chance for Calvin to convert a dormant asset into real liquidity, an opportunity the family was offering to him before taking it to outside investors. Calvin picked up the folder. He read every page. He did this slowly, in the particular way he had of reading anything important. Starting at the top, moving his eyes across each line without rushing, turning pages without commentary. Lorraine was watching from the kitchen doorway. Phyllis was sitting 3 seats down with her hands folded on the table, her expression arranged into the careful neutrality of someone trying not to broadcast how much she wanted a specific outcome. Calvin set the folder down. He looked at Derek. He said he appreciated it, but he was going to pass. That was all. No argument, no counteroffer, no explanation. The same answer he had given twice before, delivered in the same unhurried register, as if he were declining a second helping of something he had already eaten enough of. Derek's composure slipped for just a moment. It was visible the way a crack in a wall is visible. Small but permanent, once you've seen it. He said something about timing and windows closing, his voice carrying an edge that had not been there at the beginning of the evening. Phyllis looked at the tablecloth. Lorraine walked back into the kitchen without a word. Calvin folded his napkin and asked if anyone wanted coffee. The subject did not come up again that night, but in Derek's office the following week, the rendering on the wall and the timeline on his desk told a story that was becoming increasingly urgent. The city's planning committee was moving faster than his contact had suggested. Derek had perhaps 12 months before the acquisition process became public. And Calvin Rees, quiet and unmovable as a post set in concrete, was not going to sign. 3 days before the anniversary dinner, a certified mail envelope arrived at the house on Beatties Ford Road. Calvin signed for it at the door and carried it to his study. Inside was the City of Charlotte Infrastructure Development Office's formal written offer, $12,400,000 for the 4.7 acres in the Ballantyne corridor, contingent on City Council final approval, which had passed by a vote of 8-1 the previous afternoon. Calvin sat with that letter for a long time. He had known a number close to this was coming, but seeing it on official letterhead, with the city seal at the top, and a wire transfer date of the following Monday printed at the bottom, made it real in a way that the years of quiet waiting had not fully prepared him for. He thought about telling Phyllis that evening. He had been thinking about it for 3 days. He wanted her to know. He wanted to sit across from her at their own kitchen table and show her who her husband actually was. He folded the letter. He put it in his desk drawer. He told himself he would tell her at the dinner. He carried 14 years of patience and a $12 million secret into his own anniversary dinner that Saturday night. He never got the chance to tell her. And once she made her choice, he decided she never would. Pacing begins to accelerate from this chapter forward. The slow burn is over. Marcus Webb answered on the second ring. That was the thing about Webb. He had been Calvin's attorney for 11 years, had managed the Rees Land Trust documents since Roosevelt Rees's estate was settled, and he operated with the steady, unhurried professionalism of a man who had seen enough situations in his career that very little surprised him anymore. When Calvin said his name into the phone at 11 o'clock on a Saturday night, Webb did not ask why he was calling so late. He simply said he was listening. Calvin told him everything in the order it happened. The dinner, the toast, the divorce filing, the 40 people in the room. He spoke without emotion, the way a man reports a set of facts he has already processed and accepted. When he finished, there was a brief silence on the line. Not the silence of shock, but the silence of a careful man organizing his response. Webb said the first thing they needed to confirm was the separate property clause. He pulled the Rees deed transfer documents while Calvin waited. The clause had been written into the original transfer agreement in 1999 by Roosevelt Rees's estate attorney, a Charlotte lawyer named Clifton Okafor, who had understood, with the particular foresight of a man who had watched too many inheritances dissolve in bad marriages, that any property passing through the Rees family trust should carry ironclad protection from spousal claims. The clause was unambiguous. The land was Calvin's alone. It had always been Calvin's alone. No joint marital interest had ever attached to it, regardless of when any divorce proceeding was initiated. Webb said it plainly. Phyllis had no claim, not to the land, not to the acquisition proceeds, not to a single dollar of the $12,400,000 the city of Charlotte had offered, and Calvin had every right to accept. Calvin asked how quickly they could finalize the acceptance. Webb said by midnight. The documents came through electronically at 11:47. Calvin read every page on his phone, sitting in the spare bedroom of Greater Faith's associate pastor, a gentleman named Reverend Aldous Brimmer, who had asked no questions when Calvin appeared at his door 2 hours earlier, with a small bag and a composed expression that told Aldous everything he needed to know. Calvin signed each page with the care of a man who understood that his grandfather's patience and his own had finally arrived at the same destination. The city's closing coordinator received the executed documents at 11:59. Calvin turned his phone off. He slept. At 6 o'clock in the morning, Charlotte's WBTV News opened its Monday broadcast with the Silver Line story. The anchor delivered it cleanly and without drama, the way infrastructure news always gets delivered. As a matter of civic progress, a milestone in the city's transit expansion, a $47 million federal corridor project moving forward on schedule. The Ballantine parcel acquisition, the anchor said, had been finalized over the weekend. The seller was a private citizen. The city had paid $12,400,000. The seller's name was Calvin Reese. Phyllis heard it from the kitchen. She was standing at the counter in yesterday's dress, still wearing the earrings she had put on for the anniversary dinner, waiting for the coffee maker to finish its cycle. The television was on the counter the way it was every morning, volume low, more texture than attention. She was not watching it. She was staring at the window above the sink, the grey early light of a Monday morning coming through the glass, thinking whatever a woman thinks the morning after she has blown up her own marriage in front of 40 witnesses. And then she heard his name. She turned around so fast she knocked the coffee mug off the counter. It hit the tile but did not break. She stood there and listened to the rest of the segment with the mug on the floor and the coffee spreading across the grout, and her whole understanding of the previous 14 years rearranging itself like furniture being moved in a dark room. $12,400,000, his name on the deed, her cousin's corridor. She called Calvin's cell phone. It went directly to voicemail. She called again and again. She called 6 times in 4 minutes, each call hitting the same wall of silence, each one landing nowhere. 30 miles away, Derek Price was sitting in his car in the parking lot of his South Tryon office building. He had not gone inside yet. He was holding his phone in both hands, watching the WBTV clip that someone in his investor group had already texted to the thread, and he was utterly, completely still. The rendering of the Ballantine development was framed on the wall behind his desk inside, visible through the glass doors. He did not look at it. Lorraine called Phyllis 4 minutes after the broadcast ended. Phyllis did not pick up. She was still standing in the kitchen, in yesterday's clothes, in the silence she had made for herself. The coffee was still spreading across the floor. The mug was still where it had fallen. Her phone was in her hand, screen lit with 6 unanswered outgoing calls to a man who had turned his phone off, slept a full night's sleep, and was already, even then, several careful steps ahead of her. Understanding arrived in pieces, the way devastating things always do. First, the number, then the name on the deed, then the survey map on the study wall that she had walked past 1,000 times and never once looked at properly. While Phyllis stood in that kitchen and tried to calculate what she had done, Calvin Reese was already moving. Calvin walked into Marcus Webb's office on Monday morning at 9 o'clock, carrying nothing but a manila folder and the same steady composure he had carried out of his own anniversary dinner 2 nights before. Webb's office was on the 14th floor of a building on South Tryon Street, a clean, spare space that smelled like old books and printer ink, the kind of office that communicated competence without announcing it. Webb was already at the conference table when Calvin arrived. 2 copies of the deed transfer documents laid out in front of him with color-coded tabs at the relevant sections. He did not offer condolences about the marriage. He did not ask how Calvin was holding up. He simply said good morning and indicated the chair across from him, because that was the kind of man Marcus Webb was, and that was precisely why Calvin had trusted him for 11 years. They spent the first hour mapping the full legal position. The separate property clause was airtight. Webb walked through it section by section with the unhurried precision of a man who had read it many times and wanted Calvin to understand every word. The clause, drafted by Clifton Okafor in 1999, specified that the Ballantine parcel, transferred through the Reese family trust, was to remain the sole and separate property of the named heir in perpetuity insulated from any claim arising from marriage, divorce, or joint property disputes. The city acceptance documents had been executed and recorded before Phyllis's divorce filing had been formally served on Calvin. The sequence of events was not close. It was not ambiguous. There was nothing for Phyllis to reach for. Calvin's instructions to Webb were delivered in the same measured register he used for everything. No public statements, no press engagement, no contact with Phyllis or her attorney beyond what the divorce proceedings legally required. If reporters called about the Silverline story, Webb's office would confirm only that the acquisition had closed and refer all further questions to the city's communications department. Calvin did not want his name in anyone's mouth any more than it already was. Webb nodded and made a note. The second item was the wire routing. Webb contacted the city's closing coordinator that afternoon and confirmed that the $12,400,000 transfer, scheduled to clear Thursday morning, would be routed to a newly established entity, Reese Legacy Holdings, LLC, incorporated in North Carolina, with Calvin as its sole member. The trust structure provided an additional layer of separation from any future legal proceedings. By the time any attorney on Phyllis's side thought to look, the money would be sitting in a properly insulated vehicle with documentation that left no productive avenue of attack. Calvin's third move was the one that Webb had not anticipated. On Tuesday morning, Calvin placed a call to a firm called Pinnacle South Group, a Durham-based development company that had spent the better part of 3 years trying to acquire parcels along the same Ballantine corridor. Calvin had become aware of Pinnacle South through the city's public planning records. They had appeared in permit applications and corridor feasibility documents, always circling the same geography, always running into the same wall of city acquisition priority. Calvin told their principal, a developer named Reginald Foss, that his parcel had been acquired by the city and was no longer available. Then he offered something more valuable than the land itself. He provided documentation, all public record or legally obtained, detailing Derek Price's access road configuration and the specific dependency that Derek's project had on the southern corridor approach. He explained, with the calm specificity of a man who had spent 3 years reading planning documents, that without that approach route, Derek's permits were structurally untenable under the city's new Transit Exclusion Zone guidelines. Pinnacle South's attorney flagged the documentation to the city's transit planning office by Tuesday afternoon. Calvin was not breaking any rules. He was not filing a complaint. He was simply making sure that the people who needed accurate information about the corridor had it. What they did with it was their business. On Wednesday evening, Calvin drove to Greater Faith Missionary Baptist for Bible study. He parked in his usual spot, second row from the end. He sat in his usual seat, fourth pew from the front on the left side. Reverend Aldous Brimmer led the group through the book of Job with the thoughtful attention he always brought to the text, and Calvin listened and said very little, but the way he usually did. Nobody at that Bible study knew anything about land acquisitions or development projects or the $12 million sitting in a trust with his grandfather's name in its title. And Calvin offered nothing. He drove back to Reverend Brimmer's spare room, ate the plate that had been left on the stove for him, and went to sleep. Thursday morning, the wire cleared. $12,400,000 arrived in Reese Legacy Holdings, LLC, at 9:14 in the morning. Webb sent a single text message to Calvin's phone. Done. Calvin read it, set his phone face down on the nightstand, and finished his coffee. Webb filed the divorce response that afternoon. No counterclaims, no motions, no drama of any kind. Full cooperation with the proceedings, complete asset protection on every front. A response so clean and straightforward that Phyllis's attorney called Webb's office twice to make sure nothing had been missed. Nothing had been missed. Calvin's legal position was sealed from every direction, and Derek Price still had no idea what had just been done to him. He wouldn't understand it until the permits office called. Day 4. The first domino fell without a sound. Derek's contact at the Charlotte permits office called at 8:47 in the morning. Derek had been waiting for this call for days, expecting routine confirmation that his project timeline was still intact. What he got instead was a bureaucrat's careful voice reading from a formal determination letter. The city's Silver Line Transit acquisition had triggered a corridor exclusion zone. The zone covered the precise path of Derek's southern access road. The access road was legally unusable. The permits tied to that road were hereby voided pending review, and the review period was 90 days. Derek asked the man to repeat himself. The man repeated himself. Derek sat in his office for a long time after that call ended. The rendering on the wall behind his desk, the clean lines of the Ballantyne mixed-use development, the retail frontage, the parking structure, looked the same as it always had. But something behind Derek's eyes had changed, like a man watching a building he owns start to lean. Day 5 came fast. Derek called his investor group that morning. 4 men on a conference line, each of whom had written checks ranging from $200,000 to $750,000 into the Price Development Group Ballantyne Fund. He used the word setback. He used the phrase temporary regulatory issue. He did not use the word voided, and he did not use the word corridor exclusion zone, but the investors had attorneys, and the attorneys had already read the public determination filing. By noon, all 4 were demanding answers. By 2 o'clock, Phyllis was calling Derek's cell phone. She wanted her $180,000 back, not a conversation, not an explanation. The money back now. Derek did not pick up. Day 7. Phyllis's divorce attorney sat across from her at a conference table and delivered the assessment in the measured tone of someone who had checked the documents twice before speaking. The separate property clause in the original Rees deed transfer was airtight. The city acceptance had been executed and recorded before the divorce filing was formally served. The $12,400,000 sitting in Rees Legacy Holdings LLC had no surface for a legal claim to grip. Phyllis owed her own legal fees. She had no viable path to any portion of the acquisition proceeds. None. Phyllis sat with that for a moment. Then she asked her attorney to say it again. He said it again. Day 9. Derek entered private mediation with his investor group, represented by a Charlotte litigation firm that billed $400 an hour and had no patience for evasion. In the mediation process, both sides were required to produce all relevant communications. Derek's team produced the project files. The investors' attorneys produced something Derek had not anticipated, a subpoena return from his own phone carrier covering 26 months of text message records. The texts were worse than damaging. There were 41 messages sent to Phyllis over a 2-year period, many of them dispatched from family dinner tables, detailing Derek's strategy to pressure Calvin into signing the option agreement before the city's acquisition became public. There were messages describing Calvin as the obstacle, messages calling him slow and manageable. One message, sent from Lorraine's Christmas dinner table the night Derek pushed the option agreement, described Calvin as a man who didn't know what he was sitting on and never would. He was wrong about that. Day 12. A reporter from the Charlotte Business Observer called Derek's office seeking comment on a story she was developing about the Ballantyne corridor, the voided permits, and the option pressure campaign against a private landowner. Derek's assistant took the message. Derek did not return the call. Day 14. The story ran. It was thorough. It named Price Development Group. It named the Ballantyne project. It detailed the 2-year option campaign, the undervalued offers, the text messages from family gatherings. It included the amount of Phyllis's investment. It explained the corridor exclusion zone in plain language that any reader could follow. It noted that the private landowner who had sold to the city for $12,400,000 had declined to comment. Calvin was not quoted once. Day 16. Lorraine's Links chapter held its monthly meeting at a members' home in University City. The Business Observer story had been forwarded in 3 separate group threads before the meeting started. The women who arrived that evening had read it. They had seen Phyllis's name in the text. They had done the arithmetic. They knew what the anniversary dinner had looked like because several of them had been there, and now they knew what Calvin had been sitting on while Phyllis stood up at his table and told the room she was done with him. The meeting lasted 2 hours. Lorraine said very little. She drove home alone. Day 21. A process server arrived at Phyllis's apartment with a legal document from Derek's mediation proceedings. Her $180,000 investment had generated a proportional liability claim. Because she was a named investor and the mediation was producing a settlement allocation, she owed a contribution to the injured parties. Her own attorney reviewed the document that afternoon and told her quietly that she should settle. She asked if there was another option. He said not a good one. Phyllis sat across from that attorney in a room she was paying for by the hour, in a situation entirely of her own construction, with no one in the building who could help her and no one waiting outside who was coming to her rescue. Calvin was not watching any of it. He did not need to. He was attending to his own affairs with the same unhurried patience he had always brought to everything that mattered. But there was one thing left that he needed to do himself, and Phyllis had asked for it, through her attorney, without understanding what she was walking into. The mediation was scheduled for 9 o'clock on a Tuesday morning, 28 days after the anniversary dinner. It was Phyllis's attorney who had requested it, a formal sit-down to finalize the remaining divorce terms, to sign the documents, to close what was left of 14 years in a conference room on the 14th floor of a building on South Tryon Street. Calvin arrived at 8:55. He was dressed the way he always dressed, dark slacks, a pressed button-down shirt, the sensible shoes that Phyllis had once described to her mother as the most telling thing about him. He carried nothing except his copy of the agreements in a manila folder, the same kind of folder he used for everything. He greeted the receptionist by name because he had been in this building enough times over the past 4 weeks to know it. He accepted a cup of water and sat down in the conference room and waited. Phyllis arrived at 9:10. She looked like a woman who had not been sleeping well, which was accurate. She was dressed carefully, the way she always was in professional settings, but something underneath the presentation had shifted. The certainty was gone. She sat across from Calvin with her attorney beside her and Webb to Calvin's right, and for the first time in the entire story of their marriage, she had no audience. No Lorraine in the kitchen, no Derek by the fireplace, no 40 guests arranged in a dining room to perform for. It was just the two of them, and a table and the papers that would end it. Phyllis spoke first. She said she wanted it acknowledged that she had not been happy, that the marriage had not been what she needed for a long time, that she had not known about the land, and that she thought Calvin should understand that what she had done at the dinner had nothing to do with money, because she had not known about any money. Calvin listened to all of it. He did not interrupt. He did not shift in his seat. He watched her the way he had always watched things he was deciding about, with complete, unhurried attention, letting her use up every word she had brought into the room. When she finished, there was a silence. Then Calvin set his folder down on the table, folded his hands on top of it, and began to speak. He spoke quietly. He did not raise his voice once from beginning to end. He said he understood that she had not been happy, and that he was sorry the marriage had become what it became. He meant that. He said it plainly, and he moved on from it. Then he said he needed her to understand some things. He talked about the anniversary dinner. He described the moment precisely, not the humiliation of it, but the sequence. The toast, the room going quiet, the divorce papers she had already filed, her cousin by the fireplace, her mother in the kitchen not coming out. He said he had noticed all of it in the moment and had said nothing because that was what he did, and she knew that was what he did because she had been watching him do it for 14 years. He talked about the study, the desk drawer, the offer letter from the city of Charlotte that had been sitting in that drawer for 3 days before the dinner, which he had carried into that evening, intending to show her. He described the feeling of sitting at his own table with that letter in the other room and watching her stand up and speak. He talked about the survey map on the wall, the hand-drawn lines his grandfather had made. The number of times Derek had stood in that study doorway and looked at that map while pretending to be looking for something else. He talked about 2 years of option agreements, the Christmas dinner, the $2,100,000 offer framed as a family favor, the text messages Derek had sent from family tables, at dinners Phyllis had planned, describing Calvin as a man who didn't know what he was sitting on. He talked about her $180,000, the money she had given Derek for a project built on a foundation that required Calvin's land to function. The money that was gone now, not because of anything Calvin had done, but because of what Derek had not told her and what she had not thought to ask. And then he said the line that the listener had been waiting the entire story to hear. He said, "You stood up at my anniversary dinner, in my house at a table I paid for, and told 40 people you were leaving me for someone going somewhere. What you didn't know was that 3 days before you did it, this city had already decided that the ground your cousin needed was worth $12 million, and the only name on that deed was mine. I didn't say a word that night because I wanted to see exactly who you were when you thought I had nothing." He paused. "Now I know. And now, thanks to the morning news, so does everybody else." The room was very still. Phyllis did not scream. She did not make accusations or threats or demands. What happened to her face was quieter and more devastating than any of that. It was the specific, private collapse of a woman who has just understood, completely, and without any remaining ambiguity, the full weight of what she threw away, and exactly how long she had been throwing it away without knowing. Her eyes filled. She looked down at the table. She did not look back up for a long time. Calvin waited a moment. Then he picked up his pen, turned to the final page of the divorce agreement, and signed his name in the same careful hand he used for everything that mattered. He stood up. He buttoned the top button of his shirt. He thanked Marcus Webb for his time. He walked out of the conference room without looking back. What he built afterward was the only answer that ever mattered. The months that followed were quiet in the way that things are quiet after a storm has passed and taken everything loose with it. Derek Price's mediation settlement was finalized 6 weeks after the divorce papers were signed. The terms required him to liquidate the primary assets of Price Development Group Charlotte to satisfy the investor claims, the office lease on South Tryon Street, the project vehicles, the equipment, and the rendering that had been framed on his wall for 2 years. The Ballantyne development was formally dissolved. The Charlotte Business Observer ran a brief follow-up item noting the closure. It was 8 sentences long, which was about 8 sentences more than Derek's empire deserved at that point. His name in Charlotte's development community became the kind of name people used as a cautionary example in rooms he was no longer invited to enter. Phyllis settled her investor contribution quietly and without public comment. The amount came out of savings she had spent years accumulating, money that had been meant for something else entirely, and its departure left a mark that no professional composure could fully conceal. She moved from the house she had taken in the divorce proceedings to a smaller apartment in a part of Charlotte that did not have the same address weight as the one she had left. She let her Lynx chapter membership lapse without announcement. The women in that chapter noticed, the way women in those circles always notice when someone stops showing up, and they said what they said in the ways those things get said, and Phyllis was not there to manage the narrative this time. Lorraine was never mentioned publicly by Calvin, not once. Calvin was not the kind of man to settle scores with a 72-year-old woman by putting her name in anyone's mouth. But the image he carried, the one that lived in the back of his memory like a photograph left in a drawer, was of a kitchen doorway on a Saturday night, and a woman who chose to stay in it while her daughter dismantled a marriage at a dinner table 30 feet away. He never said what that silence had told him about who Lorraine was. He did not need to. He simply carried it and moved forward, the way a man who has learned the value of patience carries most things. Calvin established the Reese Legacy Foundation 4 months after the divorce was finalized. The endowment was $2 million drawn from Reese Legacy Holdings, and its purpose was homeownership education and down payment assistance for first-time buyers along the Beatties Ford Road corridor, the same corridor where Calvin had grown up, where his grandfather had taught him the value of land, and where families who looked like his had been getting pushed out for 20 years by rising prices and shrinking options. He named it after Roosevelt Reese. The announcement ran in a local neighborhood paper and on the foundation's own website, and Calvin did not give any interviews about it. Greater Faith Missionary Baptist received a facility endowment that covered the repair of the fellowship hall roof, the replacement of the kitchen equipment, and the establishment of a small library in the Sunday school wing. Reverend Aldous Brimmer announced it from the pulpit on a Sunday morning in a voice full of gratitude, and Calvin sat in his usual pew, fourth from the front on the left side, and accepted the congregation's acknowledgment with a single nod and nothing further. He was still a deacon. Same seat. Same sensible shoes. The Ballantine Corridor groundbreaking happened on a clear Thursday morning in late October. Pinnacle South Group had moved quickly once the corridor exclusion zone cleared their path, and the mixed-use development they broke ground on included a community land trust component that would keep a portion of the residential units permanently affordable for the next 40 years. Calvin attended as a quiet investor. He stood at the edge of the gathered group in a jacket and the same sensible shoes, watching a man named Reginald Foss shake hands with the city councilwoman, and he thought about his grandfather walking those 4.7 acres in 1999, putting his hand on a pine tree at the eastern boundary and saying that Calvin would know when the time was right. He had known. The foundation board met for the first time on a Wednesday evening in a conference room at Greater Faith. There were 7 members, most of them people Calvin had known for years. The 7th was a woman named Diane Ellison, a retired Charlotte Mecklenburg school principal who had been recommended by Reverend Brimmer as someone whose experience with educational equity programs would be an asset to the Foundation's home ownership workshops. She arrived 5 minutes early, which Calvin noted without comment. Toward the end of the meeting, during the discussion of the workshop eligibility criteria, Diane asked one specific, well-constructed question about whether the income thresholds adequately accounted for the asset-poor but income-stable households that often fell just outside traditional assistance brackets. Calvin looked across the table at her. He said that was exactly the right question and that he had been thinking about the same problem. She said she suspected as much from the way the criteria were written. The exchange lasted perhaps 45 seconds. It was not remarkable. But it was the kind of exchange that a man who has spent a long time being misread knows how to recognize when it finally happens, and Calvin drove home that evening with something lighter in his chest than what had been there for a long time. He took the same route he always took, past Greater Faith, past the Beatty's Ford Road corridor where the Foundation's first workshop was scheduled for the following month, past the Ballantine Cut-Off where the ground his grandfather had left him was already being turned into something that would outlast both of them. Here is what this story comes down to. Real power does not need to announce itself. It does not need an audience, and it does not perform for a room. Calvin Rees sat at his own dinner table with $12 million in a desk drawer and said nothing, because he was the kind of man who understood that what you hold quietly is almost always worth more than what you display loudly. The people who underestimated him did it because they could not imagine a strength that did not look like theirs, and that failure of imagination cost them everything. Now, I want to hear from you. If you had been in Calvin's position, sitting in that study with the offer letter in the drawer, knowing what you knew, what would you have done? Would you have told her? Would you have stayed quiet the way he did? Drop your answer in the comments, because I genuinely want to know where you land on that. If this story moved you, hit that like button. It helps more people find it, and it tells me to keep bringing you stories like this one. And if you are not subscribed yet, now is the time, because there are more stories coming that you do not want to miss. I will see you in the next one.